welcome to a very special episode of the Pakistani Experience because we have the one, the only Ben Burgis here with us. How are you doing, sir?
I am really good. How are you?
We have such an excitable start. I feel like I wish I had all those things like a local American radio stations like Ben Burgis. For people who don't know, Ben Burgis, author, teaches philosophy, is a columnist for Jacobin, which he's really proud of, which he wants on his gravestone. So I made a point that I will mention that for sure. And he's written a couple of books. So the one that got me interested, which is why I've called him here, is Canceling Comedians While the World Burns. So Ben, why does the left hate us comedians, or as Dave Chappelle calls it, my tribe?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting when I see that, right? Because clearly not everybody on the left, but there are lots of people who seem to think that somehow they're doing something important for some sort of progressive causes, you know, liberal or to the left of that, actually leftist, by yelling at Dave Chappelle. And it seems very strange to me for a few reasons. One of which is, you know, with all due respect, comedians don't actually have very much power or influence in the world. So you would not think that that if your goal is to change the world for the better, that this would be a major point of concern, or really something that you notice almost at all. And in a way, I actually think it's kind of the flip side of what we saw, you know, during the Bush years, when a lot of people seemed to think that like Jon Stewart, you know, was really important, or they actually followed him to Washington, D.C. for something called the Rally to Restore Sanity, and that's seen comedians as being politically important in a good way. Some of the canceling is a way of seeing comedians as politically important in a bad way. But in both cases, I think it's kind of misguided. And the reason that I think that it's misguided is that what happens in culture, in comedy, in movies, TV shows, books, you know, all that stuff, I think reflects what's going on in larger society much more, honestly, than it shapes what's going on in the larger society. And of course, we can argue about the things that Dave Chappelle said in his new special or whatever. I have, I've watched it. I have opinions, but I think that the more important question is, if you insist on treating comedy or other art forms as if it were the case that, you know, it was like really politically urgent to stop anybody, you know, from, or, you know, really object as vehemently as at all possible, you know, to anybody saying anything bad in them, then one, I think that's going to make you a lousy art critic, because you're going to have a really simplistic and inaccurate idea of what's going on, because you just want to reduce it to these clear categories of good and bad. And two, I think it's also bad politics, because the effect is to make us look like these kind of really annoying overgrown hall monitors, who are, you know, because most people enjoy, you know, laughing and having a good time. And if you are positioning yourself as having a problem with that, it's probably not a good look.
So the March for Sanity that you're talking about, I think the left expected that to be the July 6th insurrection for the liberals, and it turned out to be a concert and a comedy show. If only some GOP members had given those people the maps to the building, maybe Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert could have led a revolution. But can we distinguish over here? Thought. So you said comedy as an art It doesn't have that much power. Yeah, maybe if you're at Caroline's at 2 a.m. watching somebody desperate for a spot, but comedians do have some of that power, right? So if you've watched Bassam Youssef tickling the giants, he was on The Problem with Jon Stewart last week as well. He did change minds in Egypt. And even if we talk about Jon Stewart, there is an argument to be made that the skepticism about the news sort of stems from that Daily Show culture where people started turning to Jon Stewart for the news.
Well, I mean, what I'd say about that is that I don't think that people were becoming skeptical of the news mostly. I mean, I'm not saying there's no influence or that Jon Stewart didn't do anything to contribute to it. He certainly did, but I don't think it mostly stems from people watching the Daily Show, seeing them make fun of the news and deciding, that traditional media was bullshit. I think much more so it was the case that in a climate where people were already feeling that way, that they would tune in, to watch a comedian, sort of do this thing where he would both give them the news and kind of make fun of, the way that that regular news happened, because they were disillusioned with the regular news, because they, the regular news told them there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And all of that. And I think that and then like we can look at what happened after that, which is to a great extent just the collapse of traditional media, that even, CNN, Fox, whoever, things that, we think of as really popular. I mean, I think a tiny fraction of the number of people who are watching Walter Cronkite talk about Vietnam, are watching those because the technology has changed. The economic incentives have changed. And so the audiences have gotten a lot more segmented, but I mean, I don't think that's something that Jon Stewart willed into existence. I mean, I think that's something that happened because the technology changed. I think it's something that happened because we live in a much more precarious neoliberal world where it's harder for, like the kind of economic support to just be a journalist in the traditional sense. It's just not what it once was.
Jon Stewart probably didn't wield it into existence, but he's part of the zeitgeist. So now if Joe Rogan calls Sanjay Gupta to his podcast and rips him to shred over the horse dewormer, he's not the sole reason people are skeptical of CNN, but he's definitely adding to it. So more people will watch the Joe Rogan podcast with Sanjay Gupta than they would watch CNN.
Well, I think that last part is the most important part, right? Because if this same thing had happened 20 years ago, even, right? If in, we'd had, I don't know, one of the, SARS had become a global pandemic in 2001, and that's probably a few years off, but whatever. And the exact same thing had happened with ivermectin, and I guess Joe Rogan was probably still on news radio in 2001. But if somebody
he was probably taking things worse than horse dewormers back then.
Yes, well, he was definitely. I mean, sure, no question about that. But I think that but I think that if the equivalent had happened, that I mean. Let's see, did podcasts exist in 2001? Maybe just barely, right? Just
Mark Maron in his garage getting angry at everybody.
Yeah. I mean, maybe he would have had like a local access, TV show, or
Howard Stern existed with sort of.
Howard Stern existed. So that's perfect, right? So let's do Howard Stern. If Howard Stern had, was taking ivermectin during the global, SARS pandemic. And which is actually a little easier to imagine back then. He's gotten much more respectable over the years, but if that had happened and the exact same exchange had happened, now probably Sanjay Gupta wouldn't have gone on in the first place, but the 2001 version of Sanjay Gupta, but if he had, like most people would have gotten their impression of what had happened from whatever CNN said about it, if CNN deigned to cover it in the first place. So I think that, does Joe Rogan making a big issue of it contribute? Yeah, I mean, it certainly does. But I think that Joe Rogan is only in a position to influence what people think about CNN because the audiences for traditional media have collapsed, because the way that technology has changed makes it easy for people to, everybody gets to pick the media they want, right? I mean, like there was a time when, you pretty much watch TV or you listen to the radio, and there were not, a little bit more on the radio, but not that much. And there were not that many channels on TV, and unless you had cable, and that was what you had. And so everybody was watching and listening to the same media, which, there were definitely bad things about it. I think the sort of critique that people like Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman were making of that the sort of limits of acceptable debate in traditional media left out a lot of really important things that should not have been left out. But the situation we have now is that because that's collapsed to a great extent, this is one of the reasons that I think like doing debates is so valuable, because right now everybody just gets to like curate their own media diet. That that if what you want, if you like the sort of, it's like listening to, oh, I prefer the sound on, on vinyl. If you like the sort of classic feel of watching CNN, you can do that. But like, if you prefer to just watch Joe Rogan on YouTube every day, you can certainly, you can certainly do that. In fact, you could probably play it through your TV, and it has, feels about the same. You can, if you want to just surround yourself, with super right-wing media, you can do that, and everybody just kind of gets to pick, which means, and also because the way the technology has changed, if you, let's say you're a CNN viewer and you watch that, like in 2001, I don't know, I mean, you would have maybe in 6 months or something, you would like read an article that would make you wonder if they were portrayed it accurately. But if not, right? I mean, that's it, right? That's all you get, is what they say about it. Because if you weren't listening that day or whatever, to the Howard Stern show, I guess that then you wouldn't know what they said. Whereas now anybody who's vaguely curious could spend 10 seconds and immediately find the original video, and they could see that Joe Rogan, who, by the way, I think the left's attitude towards Joe Rogan is tragically misguided. We could talk about that, but they could see Joe Rogan talking to Sanjay Gupta, and they could see that the conversation was not at all as CNN described it, and it's incredibly frustrating, by the way, that example, because like the complicated truth is, okay, ivermectin. There are definitely human diseases for which it's prescribed. What Rogan took was not, it was prescribed by a doctor. It was not the kind for horses, and so saying it's horse dewormer is silly and inaccurate. I mean, it's a drug that's also used for horses, but if we're going to apply that standard to everything, right? That's look at this bottle of fluid that's used to clean cars, right? That's. But also,
Joe Rogan has a point that if John Oliver says that, I'm fine with that, because I expect it from John Oliver, because that's the show. But if Don Lemon says that, or if Jake Tapper says that, then Joe Rogan has every right to be pissed off.
No, I agree. He does have a right to be pissed off. I mean, I think in this case, he has a legitimate complaint. Like, they really did misrepresent that. Now, what makes this complicated and frustrated is that also there's no evidence that ivermectin is effective as a treatment for COVID.
There's no evidence that bleach is also effective, but Trump said it and people took it. It's a free country.
Yeah, fair enough.
So I do agree with you. I think the left does mischaracterize Joe Rogan a lot, and it makes his life easier as well. And even his fans, there's so much untruths about Joe Rogan that even when Joe Rogan says something that's problematic, you can brush it off, because the fundamental belief in all those systems, whether that's leftist media, whether it's even mainstream channels, people don't have that belief in it. So even if they report facts, nobody's going to buy it.
Yeah, I mean, so there are two issues there. One is what you're identifying, which I think is obviously right, that of course, like people aren't going to listen to the correct critique of Joe Rogan and ivermectin if what you've been bombarding them with is a easily disproven lie. So that's true and important. But the other respect to which I think leftist progressives' attitude towards Joe Rogan is misguided is that Joe Rogan, I think, is like a lot of people are. I think I think that the way he sees politics is the way that lots of Americans do, which is to say, and I without being too harsh about it, that he's he's kind of confused. He's a little all over the place, right? Which is actually typical. That most people are not weird political obsessives, like I am, maybe you are, who spend all their time talking and thinking about this stuff. So that there's, because most people have so many other things that they care more about than they care about politics, that it's not that they don't pay any attention. It's not that they don't have political impulses, political instincts. Of course they do. But because they don't spend all their time thinking about it, those don't really cohere together into an internally consistent view of the world. So people can be a little all over the place, which Joe Rogan certainly is. And obviously, what he's said in the last, few months, especially with regard to, to lots of things related to COVID, I don't like. But if we can get in the way back machine and go to 2020, he said, like Barry Weiss asked him on his show who he was going to vote for. He said, "Oh, probably Bernie." And he did this like minute of talking up how wonderful Bernie was. And then the Bernie campaign clipped it, because of course they did, because the most popular podcaster in the world, who has a vast number of fans who wouldn't necessarily even be expected to vote in Democratic primaries, said this very positive thing about it. It'd be malpractice not to talk it up. And people got mad about it because Bernie is accepting the endorsement of this terrible, problematic person, Joe Rogan. And the thing is, I think it's not that Joe Rogan doesn't say things that I like vehemently disagree with. Like, he certainly does, right? We could find like a long list of things that he said that I strongly disagree with. But like, the thing is, he's also said tons of stuff that I like. And I think that it's a huge mistake, just strategically, when you have this guy who, again, most popular podcaster in the world, who is, like it or not, I think most people find pretty likable. That sort of, I mean, whatever. I don't know Joe Rogan, but in a weird way, I feel like I do, because I've known a lot of guys who remind me of Joe Rogan, right? Who are like,
the most apt explanation is he's like the elder brother of your friend whose house you go to, and his elder brother is there getting high, telling you about the world. And
exactly, right? I mean, yeah, he's the guy who goes to the gym a lot and gets high and watches Ancient Aliens, and that's I know that guy, and you know what? I like that guy. Like he's a likable guy. I mean, you sort of roll your eyes at some of the things that you say, but I mean, who hates that guy? And I think that it's a huge mistake when you take, especially because honestly, I think if you listen to most of his views on most subjects, most of them are all right. I mean, like he believes some, zany conspiracy theories, that obviously I'm not crazy about. He, he's kind of libertarian on COVID, and he has, we could find, I think like last summer during the post George Floyd, protests and riots, I think that I think he bought into a certain amount of right-wing alarmism about that. But like, on the other hand, you could also find clips of Joe Rogan, like ranting about how terrible Trump's immigration policies were, and saying if you didn't have a problem with family separation, you're not on Team Human. You could find clips of Joe Rogan making fun of Dave Rubin for saying that we don't need regulation because Yelp reviews, could make would be
almost make Steven Crowder cry, which in itself is an achievement.
Yeah. And I think that when you take somebody like this incredibly popular, extremely likable figure who has a very politically diverse audience, and when the only times you ever talk about him are to get mad when he says something you disagree with, that just tactically, that seems misguided. It seems like, no, the way you should relate to Joe Rogan is you should play it up when he says something you do agree with, rather and, you can take a second to roll your eyes at the other stuff, but but really the focus should be on, oh, hey, look at this thing where, where Joe Rogan is interviewing Congressman Dan Crenshaw, and Crenshaw is saying it would be socialism and slavery if we had government health care, and Rogan is making very common sense objections to that, and kind of embarrassing Crenshaw. That's the sort of thing that you should emphasize.
I think it's also that, so I am a fan of Joe Rogan. It's just fun to mention the horse dewormer. My podcast called The Pakistan Experience because it was called Joe Rogan Experience. So I'm a fan. In terms of Dan Crenshaw, he's had Tulsi Gabbard, he's had Andrew Yang. He's a huge fan of the universal basic income. On the Bernie topic though, and I just want to end my point by saying that on Joe Rogan, I think the left has also pushed them. Dave Chappelle would not have made The Closer if the backlash to Sticks and Stones was not intense as much as it was. Joe Rogan has literally been pushed to Austin, has been pushed into this Republican cocoon. If he's going to meet the governor and the mayor of Austin all day, he's going to hang out with them. He's going to go hunting with Dan Crenshaw. If that's all, he's going to listen all day. Of course, he's going to get influenced. But on the topic of Bernie, Dave Chappelle...
which is really important, by the way, that I think it's what you just said is worth circling and underlining, because this is a huge problem with what we think of as canceling, or basically shunning people who you think have a bad take. Because look, humans being humans, if you're not willing to, if you cut somebody off, they're going to start hanging out with whoever will still have them, and over time they'll be influenced by them. So it's incredibly counterproductive. But I'm sorry, what were you going to say about Dave Chappelle?
So Dave Chappelle endorsed Andrew Yang. He was calling people for Andrew Yang. Joe Rogan endorsed Tulsi Gabbard. But Bernie is the one who got the flag. And it can't just be because Bernie is seen as a democratic socialist. I have a feeling it's also because the whole moniker of Bernie Bros, because Bernie is seen as patriarchy is almost used as a stick to beat Bernie with, as if Kamala's identity means more than Bernie's politics, even though Kamala's own politics they laugh in the face of what she espouses to be, and she rests on her identity rather than her politics. So because this idea of Bernie Bros has been used as a stick to beat Bernie with, you feel like, yes, the left caved in and succumbed to that pressure, but a lot of it came because that moniker of Bernie Bros already existed.
Yeah, I think that's certainly why, you're right, of course, Rogan did, also say that, his very first choice would be Tulsi, but I guess either she was out by then, or he was just kind of admitting okay, she's not going to, win. So he said, I'll probably vote for Bernie. And then I think that part of the reason that basically centrist liberals, played up the Rogan endorsement to denounce it, which is predictable, although I think also there were people who were in the Bernie camp who were agreeing with them, who were saying, oh yeah, he really shouldn't have accepted the endorsement of this terrible, problematic person, Joe Rogan. But I think that the reason, you're right, that because there was this whole Bernie Bros narrative, and so I think Joe Rogan, could be very easily fit into that, right? Because who's the, the sort of stereotypical Joe Rogan listener is very much like the stereotype of the Bernie Bro, so it fit into that kind of narrative. Which is a weird narrative in many ways. both, okay, one, if you actually look at the polling numbers, you know, the biggest gap, you know, wasn't, you know, gender, you know, it was age, you know, even in 2016, and actually young women were even more likely than young men to, you know, support him. And also, not for nothing, like, okay, hey, let's assume for the sake of argument that like that, you know, that the demographic really was young men. It's like, okay, well, hey, here, you know, here are other things that that young guys could be doing politically, right? You know, they could be, you know, they could be Trump supporters. They could be, you know, like on incel forums, you know, working their way up to doing mass shootings. You know, if Bernie Sanders is getting people in this demographic, you know, excited about progressive causes and, you know, healthcare and ending the wars and all that stuff, then, you know, that seems like a public service.
Only in America can we talk about mass shootings like that. Yeah, and you make a great argument about the left being defeatist. It's almost like they have accepted the fact that we will not win. So rather than even making an attempt to speaking to Joe Rogan's audience, why don't we do none of that and take the moral high ground, or what they see as the moral high ground, as we're the good people? And I'd rather have that and play up to that rather than even making an attempt to win.
Yeah, I mean, I think that very thing is the sort of big underlying issue, or, you know, to mix up the metaphor, sort of hovering over all of the pathologies of the left, because whether we're talking about people, you know, denouncing, you know, a comedy special, and you know, by the way, like the way that, you know, I mean, again, I watched The Closer. It was not at all what people said it was, but whatever. But whether we're talking about people, you know, denouncing a comedy special as if the, you know, the things the comedian said in it, you know, were like an editorial, you know, and this is, you know, like exactly, literally, you know, in every detail what you think, you know, that that if, you know, that if Dave Chappelle says I'm on Team Turf, you know, in a stand-up special, that's exactly like if he just said that on CNN, that, you know, that it could be part of a larger, you know, thing that he's doing. But whether that's it, or whether we're talking about people, you know, not wanting the support of a popular person, you know, whose politics, you know, are mixed bag, you know, like the Joe Rogan case, or whether we're talking, you know, whether we're talking about people not even wanting to engage with people who disagree with them, right? I mean, like I just, you know, I just debated Charlie Kirk, and there's somebody who is the editor of a left-wing journal, it's called The Spectre, who is like upset that I'd done that because I was like somehow legitimizing, you know, Charlie Kirk, you know, by
platforming. Then you're platforming him.
Yeah. Which is amazing because you know, Charlie Kirk spoke at the Republican National Convention last year. I don't think he was waiting for me to give him his big break. But in any case, I think that, like, in all of these cases, like, what's the big thing that they all have in common? The taboos about platforming, the sort of intensity about the sort of political implications of art, whether we're talking about comedy or anything else, or whether we're talking about stuff like the Rogan incident. And I think that what they all have in common is this defeatism, because if you don't think, like, if you've basically given up hope that you're actually going to convince the majority of the population and you're going to, you know, take power and implement, you know, your political program, you know, if you've basically given up hope for that, then suddenly a lot of these things that seem nonsensical because they're so obviously counterproductive start to make more sense, because because you think that politics isn't so much about trying to win people over and expand the tent and, you know, and achieve your stated, you know, your stated policy goals. You think that if you think that politics is basically about just symbolically taking a stand against the injustices of the world, which I think is a lot of what is going on here, then sure, yeah, why accept the support of bad people when you could take a much more pristine symbolic stand by rejecting that support? Why argue with much more popular people who disagree with you, where their audience could hear you, when you could just, like, you know, when you could just wash your hands of it and say, no, I'm not even going to lend the moral weight of my presence, you know, to this.
Why would you want
person.
a basket of deplorables? It's essentially, you can boil it down to that somebody's giving Bernie 1 million votes. Let's say 500,000 votes, Joe Rogan can swing. And their Democrats were like, no, we're not going to take this 500,000 votes. Well, people are going to vote for you. So if your stance is that we don't want the support of problematic or quote unquote bad people, they're going to vote for you. And a lot of people are assholes.
No, exactly. I mean, like they, you know, there is no path to, you know, to winning, you know, majority, you know, support, or, you know, especially I think the kinds of things that you'd actually have to do in order to get through any kind of platform that would actually substantively go against establishment interests, right? Like if, I mean, look at what Joe Biden, you know, who's a milquetoast centrist, has been going through to try to get his agenda, you know, passed, and try to imagine somebody like Bernie doing that. I mean, I think that you'd have to have massive pressure, you know, from the grassroots to have any hope of any of that happening. I think you'd have to, like, really rebuild the labor movement, et cetera. So all of those things are impossible without having a lot of problematic people, you know, people who, you know, might have views on certain cultural issues that we don't like and maybe have really good reasons to dislike, you know, maybe people who are not as evolved as Dave Chappelle is, you know, on some of the trans stuff, maybe people who don't want to, you know, maybe people who believe conspiracy theories about vaccines, you know, you know, think about the history of the labor movement. You know, I guarantee you that when all those sit-down strikes were happening in the 1930s, you know, there were lots of workers who were involved in that, you know, who were much more problematic in many of their views than, you know, than Joe Rogan is. But that's, you know, you have to, that's the deal, right? I mean, like when, you know, you mentioned that phrase from Hillary Clinton, you know, the basket of deplorables. And I think this is really a disturbing thing that I've seen in the last 5 years, you know, since 2016, because look, I remember, you know, I'm old enough that I can all too vividly remember, like, the 2004 election and, you know, whatever, that, like, and people, you know, were extremely, you know, Democrats, you know, were extremely, you know, bitter and demoralized about having lost. But I don't remember this level of demonization of people who voted for George W. Bush as I've seen the last 5 years for people who voted for Donald Trump. And that's really worrying to me, because if you shifted from, oh, well, obviously Donald Trump is a piece of shit, but I mean, like, you know, if you shifted from that to his voters are pieces of shit, we're just going to get angry at them instead of thinking about how it is that we can appeal to some of these people, you know, without compromising, you know, important principles. But like 70 million people voted for Donald Trump in 2020. If your view of all of them is basically that they're all in the Klan, and you're just, you know, you don't even want to think about how to reach out to any of those people, then you're going to lose. I mean, going forward, I mean, you might win the individual elections with 51% of the vote, but, you know, you're not going to, like, that's not good going forward, right? Like, there's no way to achieve anything that anything that we might call the left wants to achieve without the support of a lot of those people.
This is why Dave Chappelle's genius also comes into play. He has a great bit about poor white people and him standing in line in Iowa and being like, these are my people. And I'm like, he's not going to take care of you. He's going to take care of me because I'm rich now. So even in terms of the women's movement, Bill Burr got a lot of flack after his SNL monologue, but he had hit on a fundamental truth about white women. When we talk about suffragette movement, there was racism in the suffragette movement. It's undeniable. So sure. Bill Burr made a joke out of that. But Bill Burr, I would still always give a pass to, because I think Bill Burr even went on Conan and is like, I would hate that guy. I would hate him. I would hate him. Like, he's a character. It's almost like everything that he's saying is satire. Do you feel like Dave Chappelle sort of put down his shield a little in the closer? Because with Sticks and Stones, the jokes were bad. And my biggest issue with Sticks and Stones was that this is what a sixth grader would do. So if you're making a trans joke like, so what if I'm Chinese and you're doing a Chinese accent? It's beneath Dave Chappelle. But at least it's still a joke. With the closer, I feel like he was talking to people, and it's almost like somebody on Twitter at 4 a.m. responding to trolls. So that shield that he had, that I'm still telling jokes and it's comedy, it wasn't that clear in the closer, which is why I feel he got a lot more flack.
Yeah, that could be. So I think the closer is probably kind of halfway between that, you know, like what he was doing in something like Sticks and Stones, and the 846, I think. But anyway, whatever. Yeah, they I think it was sort of somewhere in between, right? Like 846 was, you know, was basically just a very earnest monologue that, because he's a comedian, you know, he like works just a little bit of comedy into it, but basically he's just talking. And he's being serious, and what he's doing in stuff like Sticks and Stones, where I mean, I agree with you about that example, but I mean, like, but I think that but overall in Sticks and Stones, like when he's talking about LGBT stuff in Sticks and Stones, by and large, like he's just talking about it pretty much, you know, as a pure comedian, as somebody who's, all he's really doing is sort of looking at what he sees as like sort of tension points and absurdities and something, so he can like milk humor out of it. Whereas, yeah, I think in the closer it's somewhere in between, that like, which is also, I think, maybe a very vulnerable place to be, is somewhere in between, because it's not just like 846 where it's not like quite at that level of earnestness. He is saying things that are like extreme, over the top things that you say in a comedy special, you know, because they're funny. You know, he is still doing a lot of that in the closer, but he's clearly being earnest enough that it really opens him up to you know, hey, wait a second, what's this thing that you said, you know, that's not cool, right? You know, without such a clear distinction that he can just very obviously say, no, I was just joking when I said that. I mean, what he was doing, I think, was he was trying to work through his sort of complicated feelings about his evolution on these issues, his interactions with the trans community. He was kind of trying to work through that, like using comedy, but also being pretty unguarded and pretty earnest about a lot of it, and you know, and sort of sliding back and forth, you know, between that and humor, and I think that I mean, I still think that it's the case that, if anything, honestly, what he said about those issues in that special is actually better than what he said in previous ones. Because when he said that, you know, he did the joke in Sticks and Stones that you mentioned, the Chinese person in the black body joke. I mean, I think that I think there's a different way to read it, and there is a more charitable way to read it. You know, which is that you say he's basically, you know, exploring this ambiguity between, you know, you can be transgender, you can't be trans racial, giving people's reactions to Rachel Dolezal. And there's a sort of interesting tension there that there's humor to be found in that tension. But I could also understand how people could watch that and just think, oh, he's just making this hacky attack helicopter joke, basically, that is like this sort of stupid thing that social conservatives will say is oh, maybe I sexually identify as an attack helicopter.
It's because as a comedian I expect better. I mean, I'm uncomfortable with the Bill Cosby joke, but I see the genius in it, right? With Vanilla Ice Cream, I see what he's doing. I'm uncomfortable with the OJ joke, but I see what he's doing and I appreciate it. And Chappelle's my number one. So it's almost coming from a fan that I expect more from you, Chappelle, because his understanding of race, especially with Chappelle's show on Clayton Bigsby, it's almost unfair for us to expect him to have an equal amount of understanding and nuance about all issues. But simply as a comedian, that's the standard I hold him to.
Yeah, I would say this, though, that if we compare Sticks and Stones to The Closer, Sticks and Stones, he's looking at these sort of ambiguities about how we think about, gender identity and all that stuff in order to make jokes about them. And depending on how you interpret those jokes, you might, have a problem with them very understandably, but but that's all he's doing. Whereas The Closer, I think, he's trying to actually work out okay, but seriously, how do I feel about this? And in the course of doing so, I actually think that the place that he ultimately lands is much more progressive than anything that's suggested in Sticks and Stones, that because he makes that, there's that line where it says I'm on Team Turf, but that comes, I believe, 2 minutes after saying that he doesn't know what a turf is, and about 5 minutes before saying, I'm not saying trans women aren't women, which is okay, literally, okay, actual turfs, 1, don't like being called turfs, and 2, actual turfs do not think trans women are women. That's kind of the whole point. And if you look at what he's doing there, right? He's sort of exploring in this very, even though he's being more earnest and unguarded, it's very much a comedian's way of exploring it, because he's sort of, there's a kind of on the one hand, on the other hand, and he's sort of making extreme statements when he's doing both of them, and there's sort of okay, look, there's a sense in which it does still seem to be the gender is biological, and he has the whole thing, we all slid down the legs of a woman and all that stuff, but I'm not saying they're not. And then he starts talking about this series of interactions, which is really what he's telling in that last part, is a story about his evolving attitudes, that, because he starts by talking about the set that he gave right after he walked away from Chappelle's show, where he was talking about this stuff, and he kind of suggests that whatever he said there was way worse than what he said later. He said, this is 2004, my pronoun game isn't what it is now, and he talks about people getting mad about that, and he sort of goes through all these interactions where people were getting mad at him, and he rolls his eyes and whatever, but the punchline is, but then he met this trans woman, Daphne, and he spends 10 minutes talking about his relationship with this woman, and how and what it meant to him, and how she seems to be, right, she helped him see the issue in a different light. I said, there's that whole thing about her opening for him and bombing, and then he says, but then she's heckling, but then he's enjoying the conversation so much he doesn't even care that she's heckling, and then the sort of, it's all funny, but then the kind of very earnest punchline is her saying, I just want you to acknowledge that I'm going through a real human experience, which really seems like what he wants people to take away from that, and not to mention that he also spent 5 minutes explaining why laws discriminated against trans people were so cruel and pointless, and then at the end, he, I mean, again, there's still the ambiguity, right? Because he's very purposely it's a very purposely ambiguous sentence, right? But he says, he's going to tell, the Daphne's child, when they grow up, and he gives them this, trust, this money that he set aside for them, your father was a wonderful woman. But like the tone of that is just completely different from what I saw being described online, that people were portrayed it as just this sort of all-out edgelord festival of transphobia. And that's not at all the tone. I mean, one of the last things he says in the special is, I'm not going to tell any more jokes about this until I'm sure that we're all laughing together. So, I mean, honestly, I think that I think the question is, we started off the whole conversation by talking about the extent to which it's really true or not true that comedians can influence things. But to the extent that they can, somebody who's watching this, who maybe is not great on these issues, is this special going to make them more transphobic or less transphobic? And I have a really hard time seeing how it's going to make them more transphobic, because it seems like the overall theme, and I agree, by the way, that there was this quality to it of somebody on Twitter, responding to trolls at 4 a.m. Honestly, I kind of hate it when as much as I think it's dumb, when progressives, make a big point of denouncing comedians, I also hate it when comedians like waste a lot of time in stand-up sets complaining about people denouncing them, because I just don't think it's usually very funny, and it seems kind of self-indulgent. So it was all mixed up with that, right? So I agree that makes it murkier, right? But the overall story he was telling over the special, and the overall moral of it was trying to come to a place of greater understanding and empathy. And it seems to me that to the extent that that influences anybody's attitudes, it's actually going to make them less transphobic.
Did you see what he just said? Did you see the video clip that just came out today or yesterday?
I think I was just, I think I saw on Twitter that he had put out a video clip. I've not watched it yet.
There's a funny line in it. He's like, so there was news that the trans employees of Netflix invited him and he refused. And he said, I didn't refuse. I will come, and my only condition is that all of you have to accept Hannah Gatsby is not funny, which I thought was funny. Even though I love Nanette. Nanette was one of my favorite things to watch on Netflix. So yeah, one of the things he said, one of my conditions is watch it. I'm not going to come and talk to somebody who's not watched the whole thing. So that nuance argument that you're talking about, I do feel he has the right to say it. So if he says that, if we're talking about oppression Olympics, and there was this famous Chappelle sketch about the racial draft, how are you ahead of us? And he may be wrong. And there are a lot of people, I think somebody in the culture also wrote that I'm a black gay guy. So you can't really say this is a white people thing. And that's a fair criticism. But if Dave Chappelle gets up on stage and says this gets a lot more attention because white people are doing it, he has a right to say that. And especially in a country like America, with the racial history that you have, it's also a little problematic for people to go online and tell Dave Chappelle to shut up or not say that. Even in Sticks and Stones, when he talks about Caitlyn Jenner murdering somebody and people forgetting about it, and even as a joke when he says, it's your first year and you've been labeled Woman of the Year. If I was a woman, I'd be pissed. I've been a woman for so long. So even on the turf thing, the thing that he's talking about, that feminists were like, we've been fighting for a while. You don't just get to join the team. And Chappelle has this great POV over there where he's like, just when I thought I had you, just when I thought I had you, you pull this on me. I thought I had Whitey. So he has a right to that point of view.
Yeah, I mean, look, sure. I mean, that line made me laugh, like all the, I don't have problems with trans people, I have a problem with white people stuff. But I think probably, and this is a little tricky because I think it's hard to, the least funny thing you can do to a joke is try to sort out exactly what percent is serious, what percent is
my master's is in theater. This is my degree coming into play. It's a problem. I have to analyze things.
Yeah. But like, but I think it is a little ambiguous because a lot of it's presented as jokes, the extent to which he really means some of this, and the extent to which he does it. But I think that probably the better, political criticism of the closer is not so much that he was like, you know, really being unironically, you know, transphobic, which I, you know, as we've gone through, I really don't think that was the case, but, you know, maybe he's not quite where, you know, we want him to be, but he's gone a long way in the right direction. But I think the better criticism, you know, is what you mentioned, the oppression Olympics thing, and then also this tendency to kind of see the world as if we were, you know, demographic groups, you know, Black people, white people, gay people, trans people, you know, straight people. We're like hive minds, like these are just these big collective entities that, you know, we can like, you know, we can sit down and have a conference like the racial drafts, you know, to you know, between them, which again is funny as a premise for a joke, but sometimes you almost get the sense that he really does see the world this way, you know, as if like as if, you know, it were you know, as if there were these you know, like he could speak, you know, for Black people as a group, and you know, and you know, any trans people getting upset at him, or speaking for like trans people as a group or whatever, you know, which is kind of ridiculous. And I mean, maybe to bring it back to comedy, I mean, it always reminds me of one of my favorite bits from Doug Stanhope, where he talks about how nationalism makes us stupid because you know, it you know, tells us to be proud of things we had nothing to do with. And he talks about, you know, Americans say it's like, oh, look at the French, you know, they complain about everything, but we sure saved them during World War II. And Stanhope's like, wait a second, we did that? We? Because I don't remember that. I mean, did I just, you know, get really drunk and black out and we saved the French? You know, that doesn't, you know, that doesn't sound familiar. You know, like, it's like, no, I mean, you know, there are, you know, there are just people, and so I think that as funny as it is, it's a line in a comedy special when he said, you know, that like, yeah, I was, you know, I had the white man on the ropes, and you know, and then he pulled this on me, I'm a girl now, you know, like as funny as that is, I think that it does, maybe to the extent that he's serious about it, does maybe indicate this kind of worldview where there's like the opinion of trans people and the opinion of white people and Black people and whatever, and it's and it flattens all these distinctions, like you're talking about, you know, what about Black trans people, you know, and then like it's also just kind of goofy on the merits. It's like my friend Ture Reed always points out, you know, there are more Black people in the United States than there are people in Canada, and we would never talk about like what the Canadians think about something as if all the Canadians thought the same thing, you know, but somehow, you know, we talk about, oh, here's what the Black community, you know, thinks about X, Y, or Z.
So if I may make the mistake of deeply analyzing another joke, the thing about being whitey on the ropes, he's still touching something on the zeitgeist, this oppression Olympics. It's not a racial draft, but somehow that idea of oppression Olympics and identity politics has seeped in so much into the culture that it's almost become that, where you talk about something and somebody's like, no, I have a lot more right to it because I'm trans. Then somebody comes in and is like, but I'm Black and trans. And somebody's like, no, I'm poor and trans. And this politics of victimhood as somehow their identity gives them a certain status to talk about certain things. And we have given it a social value where people are almost looking for victimhood.
Yeah, I think there is something to that, that it's that because of the way that both certain kinds of cancellation games work online and in certain kinds of media spaces, and also because of this kind of what Matt Bruder calls identitarian deference, you know, which is where you say basically, if you could start your sentence with as a, right, you know, speaking as a, then, you know, everybody's supposed to like kind of defer to you. It's like, oh, okay, right, you know, I guess I have to agree to you, gotta agree with you. Then which is a bizarre and incoherent, way to approach these things for the very obvious reason that, like, there's
easy for you to say, Ben, as a white guy.
yeah, exactly, right. As a straight cis, white man,
both of us are cancelled.
yeah. So, all right. So speaking as a white man, no, but I have,
or as what did you want Cornel West to call you? The white devil?
yeah. Speaking as a white devil, not speaking as a white devil, but despite being one. So I think, what obvious problem with that is that there are, that, like, races, sexual or gender identity groups, national, all of these categories are divided, like everything else is, into different economic interests, different ideologies, different ways of seeing the world, just different individual temperaments even. And so, of course, you're going to get wild disagreement within every single group about every single topic, because how could you not? And then the question is, well, if you're going to do the identitarian deference thing and say, oh, you have to defer to the person who's speaking as a, then how do you decide which one to defer to?
Yeah.
Like you're certainly not going to, if we're trying to figure out what you think about abortion, we're certainly not going to defer to pro-life women. But hold up, that's like 42% of women or something are pro-life. It's majority are pro-choice, and there is a little bit of a gender gap, but not nearly as much as you might think. And it's not exactly, if we're just taking a poll, it's not impossible to imagine there being some big religious revival or something where it went from being 60-40 pro-choice, pro-life among women to being 60-40 pro-life, pro-choice. And then are we going to start deferring to them, and thinking abortion should be illegal? Clearly not, right? So what you have to do is you have to decide who counts as the anointed representative of a group, which gets really arbitrary really quickly. And I think that there is, I mean, like, clearly though, as long as people are, and by the way, then you have to decide why a bunch of things don't count, right? Like, because I've heard, you can play this game from any number of different directions. I've heard plenty of right-wingers saying things like, speaking as a, Venezuelan American, I hate it when these white American leftists, tell me that the, attempted coup to overthrow, Maduro was bad, or speaking as a Jew, I think that the criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, it's like, well, okay, why don't those count, right? If we're playing this game, I think it's a stupid game, but as long as you are playing that game, yeah, of course there's an incentive to, like, find a way to portray yourself that's as oppressed as at all possible. However, you can cut up the categories, if you're, if you're half white and half Asian, you basically look white, but, you can say, well, no, as a person of color, or if you're, if you don't have any obvious disabilities, but, you've got a diagnosis, for like a learning disability, so you can have extra time on the SATs, as a disabled person, and of course, within progressive spaces, within media spaces, of course, these things get you more points. So why wouldn't you?
It's a tragedy, Ben, that you would not support a Native American Democratic candidate like Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah, no, exactly. I will say, though, I am proud of Liz for her progress on this. I saw her, I think about a week or two ago, I saw her tweet something out about Native Americans, and she used the word they. So, that's so.
Maybe she's going by they now, Ben. Maybe did you check her pronouns?
I did not check her.
We are going to get so cancelled.
I did not check their pronouns, but yeah, which is amazing, by the way. Imagine if Bernie Sanders had had said that he was, had like claimed to be, Native American or Black on a college application essay. We would never ever hear the end of that.
I almost wanted her to be the candidate so that she goes on a debate with Trump, and he just goes, Pocahontas, Pocahontas, Bigly Pocahontas.
I mean, look, whatever else you want to say about Trump, who who I think was a genuine monster. But you know, he was also a very talented insult comic. You know, like watching him plow through the rest of the Republican field in 2016, doing the like making fun of Marco Rubio with a bottle of water.
Little Rubio. My favorite was Ted Cruz's dad killed Kennedy.
And he said that the day that he locked up the Republican nomination, that he crossed the delegate threshold. It's like, well, I mean, people are saying, I don't know, that's what I'm hearing, that Ted Cruz is
your wife is ugly. It's just like,
yes, and yeah,
Trump and Triumph, two of the greatest insult comics, Trump and Triumph.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dave, we could give David Feldman credit for Triumph. I don't know who gets credit for Trump, but yeah, I think, or like the low energy Jeb Bush, and his point where
Jeb was the front runner. Jeb was the front runner.
No, everybody thought it was going to be Jeb. Like everybody was talking in like mid 2015 about, oh, we're going to get another Bush versus Clinton election. And yeah, just brutal. Like there was a point where, I mean, my favorite interaction was Trump said that he said something about Barbara Bush, Jeb, and Jeb was like, doing, how dare you, sir? Like my mother is, the most wonderful woman in the entire world. And Trump's like, oh, sounds like maybe she should run.
It's the Jeb Bush, the please clap moment, I think destroyed him. That was his moment. I think that's where he got destroyed. I'm sure if George Bush ran against Trump, he would be dealt the same hand, unfortunately. So Ben, the way you envision the left is the left should, target systems as opposed to individuals. But it's also true that for a lot of people, the political awakening comes through identity politics. So if we see the Women's March, if we see the Black Lives Matters, they're predicated on identity. And for a lot of people, them coming in towards leftist politics is through identity. So how do we bring them towards this big tent idea of the left, where your identity still matters, but we're in this together to destroy the system rather than our entire politics being predicated on just identity?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, lots of people do come in through those things that you mentioned. And, I think especially in the case of Black Lives Matter, there's a very, I think there's obviously what's being reacted to is a very, very real and disturbing, injustice. And of course, there is a racial component of that injustice, because with police shootings, I mean, anytime, you're, like a cop is pulling the trigger, right? They're making a split-second decision. Any prejudices that are in their head, are conscious or unconscious, are definitely going to play a role in that decision. So of course, absolutely, racial prejudice is part of what causes that problem. The complicated thing is that I don't actually think, at least directly, that it's the main part of the problem, because I think the main issue is that in the 70s, there was basically a bipartisan decision to, instead of expanding the Great Society, the welfare state, to essentially say, here's how we're going to deal with, all the pathologies that go with poverty, right? I mean, like, not that I'm not suggesting that there are a bunch of people in a smoke-filled room literally having this conversation, but like, I think in effect, right, this was the direction that, instead of dealing with poverty by expanding the welfare state, we're just going to like keep people in line with this much more militarized kind of policing, and crazily ramping up incarceration and
the war on drugs.
Yeah, exactly, all that stuff, right? And so I think that, of course, that disproportionately affects Black people, but the main reason it disproportionately affects Black people is that the neighborhoods that are policed these ways are poor neighborhoods, and Black people disproportionately live in poverty because the United States was like an explicitly, unambiguously, de jure apartheid state until the mid 1960s, when finally ended racial segregation, officially. And so, of course, the effect of Jim Crow and redlining and all of that stuff is that Black people are concentrated disproportionately at the bottom of the economic ladder, and thus are disproportionately, not the majority, but disproportionately, victims of police shootings. But I think the one problem potentially with framing that exclusively as a racial issue is that it sends the message to poor white people: this isn't your problem, don't worry about it, right? This is somebody else's problem. When actually, these are, this is a much more general problem, and maybe that example is a sort of way into the larger question you're asking about identity and identity politics, because the answer is certainly not to say that racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia don't exist or aren't important, because they do exist. That is important. But it is to say, let's, not tell somebody that that's not significant, or that we don't care about it, or we don't support it, or we don't want to, anything that's can reasonably be done as far as expanding anti-discrimination laws or anything like that, that of course the left should support those things, goes without saying. But I'd also like people to have a broader perspective and say, okay, what is the best thing that we could do to help people in any marginalized group? If that's ultimately the goal, is not to just sort of have endless, Robin DiAngelo vision quests about our internalized, prejudices, but, we want to materially help people in these groups. How are we going to do it? And I think that the most plausible way of doing it is with a overall redistribution of wealth and resources and power. And, you could have a version of that was narrower and more explicitly tied to identity. You could have reparations, for example. And I think if you could just like ask a magic genie to do that, right? You didn't have to worry about politics, then, sure, there's a case for that, but I think realistically, since you can't do that, you have to think, okay, well, what's the best strategy, right? If the point, of anything like this is to say, look at people, disproportionately Black in that example, who are suffering through these really unjust conditions nobody should have to live in, and you want to help that, what's the way that you're going to be able to do that? Well, I think that the way to do that is by fighting for universal programs, which will help everybody. So you can't, so the right wing can't say, oh, that's just they just want your money to like go to Black people or whatever, right? So universal programs that benefit everybody, but because they benefit everybody, they would disproportionately benefit all of the people who are worst off right now. Who's more likely to not have health insurance? Black people or white people in the United States? Who's more likely to not be able to afford to go to college? Who's more likely, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all down the line, right? So I think this sort of broad program of, let's get everybody health care. Let's make it easier to organize unions, which, by the way, also makes it harder for your boss to fire you because he's prejudiced against you, because you're gay or trans or anything else. Let's end wars, which, by the way, if you look at the demographics of of who's in the U.S. military, that would also disproportionately help racialized groups. Let's do the more ambitious, radical, long-term things. Think about how we could have it be a goal of government policy that more businesses be owned by workers, and all of that stuff, right? And all of those things, they would help everybody, which means that you could, I think, have really mobilize a majority of the population to support them, but they would also disproportionately help the people who are the most poorly served by the status quo.
So in terms of policy, I do agree with you, but in terms of political rallying or mass movements, and there's a friend of the podcast, Amar Rashid, who's a leftist politician, activist, and he's a huge fan of you. So he was sending you a Lal Salam, which translates to red salute. So that's how
Nice.
Marxist communists in Pakistan. Can you say Lal Salam?
One more time to make sure I'm...
Lal Salam.
Lal Salam.
So he asked this great question as well, right? How can we stop the left from fragmenting into identity groups, especially in Pakistan, because some classical Marxist organizations have almost been dismissive of identity. They've said the class is the only identity, and you almost need to forget your gender, sexual identity. The lot more modern leftist thinkers are a lot more inclusive. So there's this distrust, and often these identity politics groups or movements have their daggers drawn at each other. So how do we stop the left from fragmenting into these identity groups, knowing that they may be more popular in terms of mass movements?
Yeah, well, I guess there are a couple things there that if these like kind of old school, left parties or movements you're talking about are dismissive of saying that, various kinds of prejudices exist and cause harm, then, they certainly shouldn't be, because obviously those prejudices do exist and they do cause harm. If they say how that, or if they think it's not important that you fight for, laws against various forms of discrimination, or like in the gender example to police workplaces more for sexual harassment or, things like that, then that's bad, because those things should be fought for. They should be fought for a couple of reasons. One is that, the kind of old school Marxist reason is that, prejudices and bigotry divide the working class. You don't want that, and also, a lot of things that are sort of larger struggles against oppression, that take might look non-economic, have varied economic roots, so there's like the Barbara Fields line about how, it's a little absurd to portray the history of slavery as if the main point was the production of white supremacy as opposed to the production of cotton, sugar, and tobacco. Like ultimately this is, or colonialism, like these are things that were done for economic reasons, obviously. And so, it's part of an effort to achieve economic justice to try to do those things. But then the larger, maybe sappier reason is, okay, why are you a socialist in the first place? Presumably it's because you want to more, you have some basic egalitarian instincts, about how the world should work, that you don't think that people should have, that some people just deserve to have, way better lives or more power, because they were born into a rich family or a poor family, or, because they happen to have the skills that would help them move up to the middle class or whatever. And the same point should apply to race and gender and all these other things. So all of which is just to say that that if anybody is being like genuinely class reductionist, like they just don't want to talk about this other stuff ever, or they don't think it's necessary to support anti-discrimination laws, etc., then all of that would be why I would disagree with them. That said, I think that when you say that, identity-based, movements are maybe more popular right now, I think that that is something that maybe happens because we live in this neoliberal hellscape where there's been this just this devastating wreckage of the kind of workers' movements that existed in the 20th century. And so, a lot of people just given up hope on all of that. And then they sort of turn towards, it's like, okay, maybe we can at least do something about this, or maybe it doesn't even occur to them that, that we could have like broad-based economic, movements, because it just seems obvious that the only things that even occur to them as ways that you could fight for a more just society politically would be identitarian ways. But I don't think we should just accept that, because Because I think that if we just accept that, well, that's just how things are, that, you know, that these things are just necessarily, you know, more popular, then you're really hobbling your ability to do anything fundamental against the status quo. Because I think one of the big problems with identitarian politics is that even if you could achieve everything you wanted to achieve politically, and again, I think the more we're divided up along these lines, the less realistically we actually are able to achieve anything. But even if you could achieve everything, well, to the extent that you're using identity as the main prism through which you look at injustice in society, then okay, great, we should have anti-discrimination laws, affirmative action, all of that stuff. I'm all for all of those things. But then the question is, okay, what would be the sort of long-term goal? What would really count as winning? What would count as just society? And to the extent that you're looking at these things through a prism of identity, this is where the kind of point that like people like Adolph Reed and Walter Ben Michaels make really starts to have some teeth, because you think, okay, well, what are we really talking about here? Like, would we be happy if there were still people who continued to live in poverty and be in inadequate housing and be exposed to really militarized policing and all this stuff, but exactly the right proportion of them were Black, and exactly the right proportion were white, and exactly the right proportion were Hispanic? Or even more so, because I think in practice, a lot of identity politics isn't even about that, right? Lifting people out of poverty. A lot of it in practice is about diversifying the top layer of the economic hierarchy. That, you know, we're going to have, yeah, exactly. The board of directors of Goldman Sachs is going to have exactly the right proportions of Black people and white people and gay people and trans people. And you know, we could have that could happen, but I don't think that would, like, I don't think that would actually help most people very much. And it wouldn't even help most people in those groups very much.
Where's the Marxist Dave Chappelle who can make that point that it was easier for brats to adopt BLM, but they started distancing themselves from BLM when they found out BLM was Marxist? So it was easier for them to say Black Lives Matter, but it was harder for them to associate with a Marxist organization.
Yeah, I mean, look, if they, nothing would make me happier than a Marxist Dave Chappelle. I don't know if one's coming on the scene anytime soon.
I mean, you do say the left has no humor, but there's no great right-wing comic as well. It was Colin Quinn, maybe?
I think that's right. So I think that I think most comedians are liberals, basically. Like I think maybe libertarians in some cases, you know, but like either libertarians or like kind of mainstream progressive-ish liberals, you know, like I think those are the groups of people who, for whatever reason, tend to become comedians. I think one reason might be that if you don't, you know, like if you aren't obsessed with politics, like you only pay a little bit of attention to it, then probably you either end up as a mainstream liberal or mainstream conservative. Those would be the main destinations. And, you know, I don't know, maybe the conservative worldview doesn't lend itself to being funny. So you have more funny liberals, and then like, you know, the libertarian thing maybe makes sense too, because, you know, because if there's one thing, you know, like I think you know, comedy probably has a natural affinity to, you know, that sort of, I should be able to do what I want, you know, don't, you know, let's, you know, we should, you know, legalize drugs, leave me alone, you know, like that kind of thing, you know, probably is a natural worldview.
No comedians on the right, just clowns. I mean, it's also interesting. So Richard Pryor got a lot of flack, which I just thought of because he went to an event and then used the F word and said, kiss my ass. But then there are also stories of Richard Pryor sleeping with men. So this idea of identity that we want to thrust onto, and there's a lot of discussion on this Western lens of LGBTQ and how they colonize identity and they force you into boxes, whereas maybe and now this is broad generalization when I say Eastern, but I'm talking about the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, our identity of gender and sexuality is a lot more fluid, whereas the West is desperately trying to find categories, whereas like now there are 35 genders, now there's 65 genders, rather than realizing you'll never be able to box all of them, and it's all fluid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess I wouldn't know on that last, that last part about the subcontinent, but I do, I do think that there is a certain kind of instinct towards, categorizing that happens when we talk about gender identity and stuff like that, and it's an interesting question why, right? That it's important. You have all these increasingly nuanced labels, that I'm going to avoid using examples because I would probably reveal my ignorance and get in trouble. But I think that it does often feel like you have these increasingly nuanced and specific labels for sort of different flavors of experience of gender or sexuality or other things. And I wonder if one reason for that has to do with kind of giving sort of corporate or university, diversity enforcement, like, things that they can understand to work with, right? Here are all the categories, and how much some of it might even just come from like the fact that some of these spaces, there is such a premium put on speaking as a, right? So you have to say exactly what you're speaking as, like instead of just like, because if you're in a context where you're just like, I don't know, having a conversation with a really good friend or a therapist or something about like, it's like, oh, here are the stereotypically, male things that appeal to me. Here are the stereotypically female things to me, appeal to me. I'm mostly attracted to women, but sometimes I sleep with men, whatever, right? If you're just having a casual conversation about it, you could just say the paragraph, right? But if you need to explain exactly, what you're speaking as, then you have to come up with a label.
This is why this Western framework of LGBTQ comes into clash with identities of people that they've lived for forever. So, for instance, there are people in villages who sleep with men, but would get offended if you call them gay, because somehow they see being gay as being inferior, or there's certain stereotypes attached to being gay. So they don't see the act of sleeping with men as being gay. So these notions of these identities. Since you were talking about that, and the extreme example of that is somebody like Jordan Peterson that I know, which also is strange that you got cancelled for not wishing death upon Jordan Peterson.
Yes,
which
that's right.
shows you how desperate we are to have the forks out. But Jordan Peterson is an idiot who'd say something extreme like, how much do I have to contribute to your delusion? I just clean your bed. Just clean your bed, whatever gender. So but then we give people like Brett Weinstein or Jordan Peterson pegs to hang their careers on, which in their colleges, maybe there's an extreme example of how much the left is pushing these ideas of identity. And then you make martyrs of people like this that the right then eulogizes and makes heroes out of.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's funny, the Jordan Peterson example, because I've actually devoted a lot of time to criticizing Jordan Peterson over the years.
The Myth and Mayhem?
Yeah, Myth and Mayhem was a book that I contributed a chapter to it that was about, Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. Even before then, though, the first time I was ever on YouTube, right? It was a lecture, about Jordan Peterson, and I've you can find numerous segments, where I've gone after Jordan Peterson. I obviously could not disagree with his ideas about the subjects you just mentioned, and many other subjects as well, more than I do. But that particular tweet that people got mad about, I had, the context of it was after Peterson's wife had gotten a cancer diagnosis. I think she was actually okay now, went into remission, but after that had happened, he'd sort of spiraled into depression, and he'd started taking benzos, and he got addicted, and then he was checking himself into rehab, and the offending tweet, I think I can remember it word for word, was I obviously disagree with all of Jordan Peterson's positions, but at this moment I wish him nothing but well and hope he can have a speedy recovery.
Just the fact that as a human being you had to say that. I obviously disagree with him, but even if you had said I wish him well right now, that would have sufficed. But you still felt the need to say that because the pitchforks will be out.
And saying that wasn't enough, right? So it was still, oh my God, this terrible bigot, and you're saying this nice thing about him that that you hope he you hope that he beats his drug problem.
Ben, would you kill a baby Jordan Peterson?
I would not. In that case, though, right? Like, I'll also say, by the way, part of the backstory here, it's not somebody I could name, because it's not my, it's not mine to tell publicly, right? But like, I had somebody I care about had actually had an overdose, and like been rushed to the hospital. Like literally, I got in the phone call telling me that had happened like an hour before I saw this story. So that was kind of very much on my mind, when I saw it, that I, people I care about have struggled with, with drug addiction. I take it seriously. And I don't actually wish that on anybody, like I hope anybody, find the worst person you could think of and, have them have that problem. And I would hope that they kick it, but, and I don't even think Jordan Peterson is the worst person I could think of. I think he's just like kind of a crazy guy who has a lot of bad views, but yeah, I think it is very true, right? So Michael Brooks talks about this a little bit in his book Against the Web, that we oftentimes, the way that activists interact with these figures, really, this is yeah, as you said, it's what their careers are launched out of. It's, Brett Weinstein was a biology professor at a Evergreen College, which is a college I've only ever heard of in the context of this controversy. It's a very small college. So he was he's a biology professor at a small liberal arts college, which is a perfectly good thing to do with your life, but also like in the normal course of things, none of us would have ever heard his name, right? None of us would have any reason to know who he was, if not for the fact that he was subject to this sort of crazy over the top, people, very strange sort of series of events with student protests, at Evergreen College, which it's like, okay, congratulations, right? You just gave the world Brett Weinstein. Ben Shapiro on his, I guess not his last book at this point, but the one that came out in 2019, the Right Side of History, How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great, which unfortunately I have read. But the back cover of that book is all about how many people, how many cops had to be at such and such university, to give them security because of all the protests. It's like they love this stuff, right? Nothing could do them a bigger favor in terms of their branding. And people sometimes, my favorite example of this, by the way, if you remember, I know I'm going to mispronounce his last name, but I'm going to take a run at it. Milo Yiannopoulos.
You're closer than I would get.
Okay.
Yeah.
But like Milo, the two examples that people give of no, it's actually good to, disruptively deplatform people, because it works.
Alex Jones and Milo.
Yeah, Alex Jones and Milo. Which now Alex Jones, yeah, to a great extent did work, but that's because it wasn't us, it was YouTube. That
it's the aliens, Ben. It's the aliens.
Because these giant corporations that have this massive control over the flow of information, if they decide to shut somebody down, they could do it, which, by the way, as a leftist, you should find terrifying. Because
I got targeted by the left for being against Twitter taking off Trump.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that one too. But corporate deplatforming, sure, that could work, right? But like just us sort of activists, yelling at people or, whatever, punching Richard Spencer in the street, which, don't get me wrong, I don't want to be a hypocrite about this.
Enjoyed the clip.
I enjoyed the clip tremendously, right? I've watched that clip many times in many remixes, and it always makes me laugh. But because, even aside from being a Nazi, Richard Spencer has like the most punchable face that's ever existed. He has this kind of used car salesman demeanor to him. It's very satisfying to watch. It would not have been funny if he was like a few inches shorter or anything like that.
If John Oliver was punched in the street.
Yeah, John Oliver was punched in the face. That would be kind of funny. I'll give you that. Depending on the circumstance. But yeah, so but like people will bring these up, like Rich Spencer, Miles, like, oh, see, this stuff works. It's like, okay, first of all, Richard Spencer, the only reason that played well is that everybody already hated him. That he has no constituency. They're like, like Charlottesville was their Woodstock, and that was like all of them from all across the country, and that was like a few hundred people. It's nothing. He was sort of, he would go on CNN as like the circus act, like look at the clean, well-spoken Nazi, but he had no base of support. Even conservatives hated him. Everybody hated him. So of course, when he was punched in that way, it's kind of funny how it happened. So everybody enjoyed it. But if you punched, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, that would not play well, right? So that's one thing. And then when it comes to Milo, it's in a way, it's even a sadder example, because not only did the left try and deplatform Milo, not make Milo go away to the extent that it's gone away. That's what built his career in the first place, because he's like that was his whole shtick, is look at me, I'm so dangerous that people are just going to constantly be yelling at me and trying to stop me, speaking everywhere I go, because I'm speaking forbidden truths, or I'm just so outrageous and funny, or whatever, right? And so Milo would not have had a career if not for attempts to deplatform him. That would have like gone anywhere anybody would have heard of. And ultimately, he wasn't effectively deplatformed by the left. He was the right. That after the clip came out of him saying that whatever he said, age of consent laws, he, as a adolescent or teen, I don't remember exactly how old he said he was, right? He'd had a relationship with an older man, and he actually thinks that, is good, is a good thing, which, is probably, to be honest, not even in the top 50% of like the most offensive things that Milo's ever said, but it was the one that offended his backers, so he was disinvited from CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, and his publisher canceled his book contract, and, everybody dropped him. So now, in order to try to come back in his desperate bid for attention, look at me, right? He has...
It's troll culture. It's troll culture 101. Like, and if somebody punches Ben Shapiro, that would be a book. Punched the real face of America and the modern left. Probably book tour out of that. My favorite tweet is Ben Shapiro is a stupid person's idea of what a smart person sounds like.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. I just watched a couple weeks ago Shapiro's debate with friend Annika Asparian, and there's a point where you can tell that like he's getting flustered and he doesn't know, he doesn't quite know how to respond to her, and he says, and he keeps saying that everything's a fallacy, and like talking faster, and it's like, yeah, all right, I get it, that's the shtick, that's what people, that's what people think, sounded smart is like.
Said something like, do you think people are stupid? If there's climate change and people's houses will drown, they'll just sell them and get houses elsewhere.
Yeah, that's right. That
if the buy those drowned houses?
If the sea levels rise, you just sell your seaside property. Which, yes, that I think the kind of viral response to that was from a YouTuber called HBomber Guy, who said, you know, sell it to who, Ben? Fucking Aquaman. It doesn't make any sense. But he said that to a room full of grown-ups and nobody laughed because he was speaking very quickly and he sounded very confident. And so it's easy for that to just sort of sail by. And then you think about it later and you're like, wait, what? It doesn't make sense.
On the question of deplatforming, you also have an interesting idea about the nationalization of these social media platforms. Is the argument just that they're public entities, which is also an argument that Joe Rogan makes?
Basically, yeah. So I think, and also I should say, part of this in the U.S. context is that you know, if they were publicly owned entities, then the First Amendment would apply to them. That in other words, it's harder the same way that you know, if some little Baptist college wants to fire a professor, you know, who says something they don't like, they can just do it basically, right? As long as they didn't violate the terms of his contract, you know, they're fine legally. But when like Ronald Reagan wanted to fire Angela Davis, you know, from the University of California, you know, for being a communist, he couldn't do it. The courts didn't let him do it because as a public employee, if you're fired for the content of your political views, that's the government punishing you for your speech, which you're not allowed to do legally given the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And so part of the argument there is that given that if YouTube and, you know, Twitter were publicly owned, then these constitutional protections would apply. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a complete free-for-all. You can't have any rules. I mean, like, it's not like, you know, when a city council meeting has a public comment section, it's not like you can just go up there and start like screaming racial slurs and, you know, swearing at people without being asked to leave, you know, but you know, so you could have some rules, but, you know, but you'd have to, but, you know, if your free speech rights were being violated, you know, you could sue over that. And I think that the reason, you know, that I care about that, so that's part of the argument. Another part of the argument is that I think the incentives of social media companies, the profit incentives, often lead to them like really going out of their way to try to find ways to make their product as addictive as all possible, right? They want people to just keep scrolling, you know, all day, every day, and not, you know, log off and, you know, get some fresh air. I think that I would like to remove that profit incentive. I don't know that we'd immediately, I don't think that would like end social media addiction the next day or anything. I certainly don't think so, but at least I'd like to remove the incentive to make the problem worse. But on the free speech point, I think what a lot of conservatives will say about this, because this is kind of a weird issue, because lots of conservatives and libertarians actually do object to YouTube and Twitter censorship, even though from their perspective, it's a little hard to say why, because like, come on, don't you guys think the private companies should be allowed to do whatever they want? Whereas
you can't bake a cake, but you can ban somebody off YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. So whereas I think a lot of progressives and even leftists are inconsistent in the other direction, and because, you know, normally they understand, we understand that that it's possible to that, you know, corporations can be, you know, as authoritarian, as big a threat, you know, to rights that we care about as the government. Like in most contexts, we can understand that, but then suddenly a lot of people, when they start talking about, you know, tech censorship, will say, it's a private company, right? And they start sounding like libertarians saying the baker shouldn't have to, you know, make the cake for the gay wedding. I would prefer to just have a consistently socialist view and say, yeah, of course. I mean, like, we understand that, living in a capitalist society, that private corporations have at least as much control over what we can see and hear and listen to as the government does in practice, at least given a certain degree of political freedom. And that's a problem, right? If we value free speech, open exchange of ideas, then we should be against censorship. And I think we can also offer a better solution, because the solution a lot of conservatives and libertarians will offer is basically we should get rid of something called Section 230, which says that you can't sue a platform because of something that happens on that platform, right? Basically the same way that you
publishers.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a platform rather than a publisher. In other words, like, you could sue the New York Times for something that they printed in the New York Times, because that's like their editorial discretion. They decide what to print and what not to print. Whereas you can't sue AT&T for something that somebody says in a phone call, using AT&T, because they're just a neutral platform. And so what Section 230 does is it extends the same courtesy to the tech companies, and says that, you can't sue YouTube or Twitter for what somebody says on YouTube or Twitter, because they're not, you're not a publisher, you're a neutral platform. And so conservatives will say, well, look, they want it both ways, right? And this part is not wrong, right? They want it both ways. They want to have this legal protection that, that's premised on the idea that they're not a publisher exercising editorial discretion, but then they also want to censor things, which is it. But then, okay, fair enough so far, but what's your solution? And a lot of times their solution is to say, let's get rid of Section 230. But if you got rid of that, then censorship would go through the roof, because anything that some YouTube employee, or realistically an automated, the YouTube algorithm just mindlessly decided might, be actionable, they would just immediately take down, because they're always going to, err on the side of the corporate bottom line. Whereas if these were publicly owned entities, legally, it would be harder to interfere with speech on them. And again, also, like, let's say it can't be a complete free-for-all, that you have to have certain rules, whatever. Okay, but who do you want to make those rules, right? Do you want those rules to be made in some sort of collective democratic process that's all out there where we could see it, or do you want these rules to be made, within some corporate offices where none of us have any input into them? It's not all transparent, how they're enforced. And you essentially have no right of appeal.
I think in a country like Pakistan, where Twitter receives hundreds of requests from the government, and even in India, so Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, they're all seen as these liberal bubbles out of Silicon Valley in the US, whereas the censorship that we see, and part of the reason I was against the banning of Trump, because I saw that once these private companies have this much power, countries can leverage that to ban dissent. So we see how Indian activists were banned off Twitter. We see how Pakistani activists are banned off Twitter, where these companies who espouse liberal values in the US succumb to the state and ban dissent. So if it's nationalized and the state can do that itself, and in our region, there's a fundamental distrust of the state, it only compounds the problem.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that as to like whether a parallel solution would make sense in Pakistan, I mean, maybe not right now, maybe at some point in the future when there are much better free speech protections in Pakistan, then it would make more sense there. But yeah, I mean, I think on the Trump issue, I think it's really unfortunate that a lot of people, their views on this stuff are so held captive to these sort of emotional ups and downs of the daily news cycle, who are you mad at right now? And like, if the people that you're mad at, are getting theirs, right, you'll cheer for that. And if people you do like, are getting theirs, you'd be mad about that. And I think it's important to like take a step back and think about, okay, but like, what do we think the rules should be, and how what kind of rules are going to be a good idea or even good for us, long term. And I think I was pretty disturbed when I saw a lot of people like minimizing that issue, saying like, oh, well, whatever, terms of service, he could still give press conferences, even if he's not on Twitter.
Yeah, but they did nothing for 4 years when he was the president, when he was saying the same things.
No, of course not, because he already lost the election. He was on his way out. So, so he was more vulnerable. But like, it is a pretty astonishing display of power for private corporations to just decide that they're going to cut off one of the main lines of communication from the sitting president of the United States to the public. And I mean, look, I'm not going to cry a lot of tears for Donald Trump, although, I did think his Twitter feed was pretty funny. So like we've all lost that, but I still remember his like 2017, New Year's message, where it's like, Happy New Year's to everybody.
Even the losers.
Even the losers and haters who tried so hard to stop me. I'm sorry, that's funny.
I think only Rosie O'Donnell is his comedic best. Yeah. That timing, I think comics were jealous when only Rosie O'Donnell. That was his comedic perfection.
No question. But like, look, I'm not going to cry in tears for Donald Trump. I mean, he's a monster. He separated families. He assassinated Soleimani, brought us to the brink of war with Iran, et cetera, right? But I do not love the precedent because, like, if you can do that to the sitting president of the United States, who can't you do it to? And it's also, frankly, it's not a comfortable thought, but it's not hard to imagine a set of circumstances in which the shoe could be on the other foot, right? Pretend that Bernie Sanders had won the 2016 election, and that he had the equivalent had happened, that he had given a fiery speech to some protesters, and then after he left, the protest turned into a riot, and people did illegal things, which is not a sequence of events that like stretches the imagination to see happening. That something like that could happen, and then they say, well, he was inciting a riot, and they take him off Twitter. I would say in that set of circumstances, we'd all be furious about it, and we should all be furious about it. And I think that we shouldn't. We should be, I mean, look, and you could say, fair enough, we can't really control this stuff, whatever, fine, right? But to the extent that we're weighing in on it, right, that like, if we're going to have opinions about this in the first place, and you think that matters, we should be pushing for the rules that govern all these platforms to really err on the side of free speech, because long term, the tech censors are not our friends. These are giant, ultra profitable corporations. If they're not censoring the left that much right now, the only reason is that they don't think that we pose much of a threat to their power and their profits.
Absolutely. I think I can speak to you for hours, and I know I've taken up a lot of your time. We didn't really get deep into performative politics, but I got a real good question from somebody, and I know you've spoken about how the left obsessed over Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's "Eat the Rich" dress, but nobody really spoke about her vote. What did she change? She changed from no to present for giving military aid.
Yeah, the Iron Dome funding. Yeah, like that was indefensible, I think.
Let me just ask the question, because then you can connect the two. Do you see any future for anti-imperialism in US mainstream politics? Or do you think recent actions of even members of the squad, from EEC to Bowman, signal that reneging on political commitments that go against US empirical interests is necessary for US leftists to survive in the US political arena? It's a good question.
That is a good question. Yeah, I think, okay, so I think yes, but it's a qualified yes. So yes to the first part, right? Like I do think there's a future for anti-imperialist politics in the U.S. But there is obviously a structural problem with that, which is not even so much the problem we might have had with that in, you know, I mean, we were talking about 2001 earlier, you know, like back in that period in like 2001, 2002, 2003, when there was all this like jingoistic hysteria, and like, you know, Michael Moore was booed at the Oscars, you know, for talking about Iraq, right? The hard to imagine now, but that happened. So that's not so much the problem, right? That people that people are going to get, you know, really mad at you for, you know, that you're just going to be shunned from mainstream politics for having anti-war positions, because honestly, I think in the last 20 years, the public has gotten like pretty sick of the United States, you know, waging endless war everywhere. I mean, when Biden withdrew from Afghanistan finally,
disastrously also.
Disastrously.
The withdrawal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a little bit complicated because when people say that like, oh, you know, it was botched, it's like, yeah, I think there's a certain sense in which that's true, but I also think a lot of people who say that wouldn't like what a non-botched withdrawal would look like, which would just be like, because realistically, what is it, right, that he could have done differently, and that would have led to a better result? I can only think of one thing, right? The thing that like, if you wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan without chaos, then the way to do that would be to just openly acknowledge that we all know
mission not accomplished. Put up a banner.
Mission not accomplished banner, and just openly admit that this government the US has been propping up the last 20 years is clearly impossible to survive in a day on its own, and then just like basically do a negotiated surrender to the Taliban, right? That would be the way to have a non-chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I would have been fine with that, but I suspect that, you know, a lot of people who are mad at Biden for the withdrawal from Afghanistan would not have been remotely okay with that.
I actually give Trump some credit for the withdrawal. I think Trump sort of started that withdrawal, whereas Biden is in bed with the military-industrial complex. He might have had a harder time starting that process had Trump not started it. At least that's what I think.
Although I will also say that I find it pretty significant that that, you know, Trump, you know, sure, you know, he negotiated, you know, a timeline, but like at the end, his presidency, and in such a way as that the Band-Aid wouldn't be ripped off until he left office, right? I mean, like I don't think he wanted to be blamed for the chaos, you know, that was inevitably going to happen when the US finally left. But despite all of that chaos, and despite the media relentlessly demonizing Biden for the withdrawal, like in polls, majority of the public still say it was good to withdraw from Afghanistan. Like this sort of weeks of relentless footage of, you know, people clinging to planes and all that stuff, right? None of that stuff really stopped that, because I think most people are actually happier that, like, no, we could be at war there for another 20 years, really? You know, I think that's a pretty popular position. That said, I think that the problem that there is faced by anti-imperialist politics going forward in the United States is not so much that the majority of the public is rabidly pro-war, because I don't think that's really true anymore. It's that the brutal truth is just that most Americans just don't care very much one way or the other, right? They just don't take that much of an interest in it. You know, that, you know, if people on the other side of the world that they don't really have to think about are being murdered in drone strikes, you know, that's not a, you know, that's something that unfortunately it's very hard to get, you know, a significant portion of the public, you know, worked up about. So I think that's the bigger impediment to anti-imperialist politics going forward. So how can we do it, right? I mean, like given this, right? I mean, so do we just give up, right, on those issues? I hope not, right? So what can we do? And I think that the most effective strategy probably going forward is to emphasize the guns versus butter trade-offs, that you know, that we could have this massive sprawling empire with hundreds of bases all around the world, and you know, we can, it's and somebody in the basement in Langley, can review some footage and, authorize a strike, on the other end of the world, and it happens within minutes, that we can have all of this, or we could divert that money to things that would actually help working class people in the United States. And I think if we can frame the argument in those terms, then we have a much better chance of pushing those politics. So like in the AOC example, what seems so craven about that is that, she changed her vote, presumably in response to pressure because of, the pro-Israel, contingent in her district and in, Washington, D.C. But like, how would, like, if you're going to vote against it, which to be fair, I think Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and a few other people did, that like, if you're going to vote against it, how could you pitch that in a way that makes sense to most people? How about this, right? Like, we keep being told that there's not enough money to give everybody in the United States healthcare, or, to end college tuition, or, to do universal pre-K, or, any of these things. But what, we have an extra $1 billion to give to the Israeli military on top of all the billions that we're already giving them. I mean, that's hey, Israel has national health care, that like maybe they could, if they want the Iron Dome, maybe they can pay for it themselves, and then, we could reallocate all this money in ways that will help people in the United States. And by the way, we also shouldn't be funding this military machine that is, crushing the stateless population for the last 50 years. But, again, I think that message might have a little bit more oomph if it's tied to the first part.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you feel like Republican politicians are a lot more answerable to their base? So somebody like Dan Canshaw has to vote along party lines, or else he wouldn't be in the parliament, the House of Representatives. But whereas somebody with AOC, it's almost like we're happy that she's there and she can vote forever and she'll remain AOC. Whereas, why does the left not pressurize its people, or are they just happy to have any representation at all?
Sure. Well, I think some people are happy to have any representation. Some people will get very mad and just start denouncing, these people, the kind of Jimmy Dore response. But also, I think that the bigger, I think the structural reason is that the mechanisms just aren't there right now to effectively pressure these representatives, right? So, like, the pressure that's on AOC right now is like from Nancy Pelosi. It's from the Democratic leadership, and that's who she was really buckling to, when she switched her vote on the Iron Dome. Why is there effective pressure on her for the left? Well, I think the reason, the unfortunate truth is that the left just isn't very strong. So it's not in very much of a position to exert pressure right now. I mean, ideally, the situation would be that, I don't know, DSA, Justice Democrats, whoever would be able to say, hey, we don't like that vote. You do that again. And next time, the next election, we're going to endorse a primary challenger. And the problem is, if they tried to do that right now, I think she would say, well, okay, good, have fun with that, right? Like that's not going to have any effect on me, like, because that's just not going to, be enough to swing it. Whereas, like, if the left were strong enough on the ground, right, not on YouTube, right, not on Twitter, that, like, but on the ground, like, in this sort of grassroots organization, unions, people doing door-to-door canvassing. If that was a strong enough infrastructure that was actually in a position to enforce consequences when our representatives essentially, right? I mean, obviously the peculiarities of the American electoral system, right? It's not like, there are countries in the world where there are 10 communist parties. They all have, a few people in parliament, but like in the United States, due to the peculiarities that there are of our electoral system, that we essentially have. I mean, AOC has actually said this, that like in a normal country, she and Chuck Schumer would not be members of the same political party, we essentially have like 6 parties that are all part of the Democrats, but
big tent party.
Yeah. Right. So, but who are essentially our representatives, people like AOC or Rashid Tlaib or whoever, right? Like that, ideally what we would have is a very organized left that was very strong in that grassroots infrastructure that would be in a position where if we decided that we didn't like somebody, that they were no longer representing us, we would, they would be under real threat about whether they could keep their seat in the future. That would really matter, right? That, it's like, oh, well, we're going to like expel, AOC from, Democratic Socialist America. That'll be a big deal, right? As opposed to just something that if it happened now, it would be like a novelty story, that a few people would cover and it wouldn't really, have any impact on anything. So whereas like the Republicans, like if, if Dan Crenshaw suddenly started voting in ways that they don't like, that he went soft, then there are all these like, Tea Party kinds of groups that, that might actually be able to mount some kind of primary challenge. And more importantly, where does his money come from, right? The donors, the donors could cut him off. Whereas, right now, I think that if the organized left, made some kind of decision that like, AOC has disappointed us too many times, that we're not going to, support her anymore. Well, one, we already have like, there are like 10 people like this in Congress total, right? So it's like, that makes it a lot harder to say, we're just going to stop supporting a couple of them, but then two, okay, if we did that, that wouldn't really, I mean, most of her funding is not coming through us. It's just coming through direct appeals, to donors. And she, I don't think she's worried that, that there's like, if there was some sort of like, Jimmy Dore kind of backed, primary challenger to AOC in 2022, that person would get a lot of play on Twitter, and most people in the Bronx would never hear of them.
Or Jimmy Dore himself. The left has lost Jimmy Dore. I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think he'll run for elections. I don't think he's interested.
I don't think he would. It's an interesting thought, but I don't think he would.
I think the worst we can do is revoke AOC's citizenship to Chad. I think she's not allowed in Chad anymore. Thank you so much, Ben. I think it was a pleasure to talk to you. If I can just end this on, because I think it's very important for people to also hear this. How much has the left lost losing Michael Brooks?
Quite a lot, I think, for a lot of reasons. I think that one of them is just that, he was a really insightful and charismatic and funny guy who was people found instinctively likable, and that we could, I mean, that's I think that if he'd had I think if he'd had a longer career, like even 5 years longer, right? Like I think he would have been a much bigger deal than he was. So I think that's part of it, but I also think there's part of it that's more, it's more directly political, because I think he had a way of, this kind of very analytically smart, but also very emotionally intelligent way of interacting with with people both on the left and then in the larger population, such that he could like make the kinds of critiques that would get anybody else canceled, but but people to get that mad at him for it, right? On the one hand, but on the other hand, like there's a speech you can see you can find this on YouTube. There's a lecture that he gave at Lafayette College just before the pandemic, locked everything down, where he's, I mean, the lecture itself is great. I love it. But the best part is the Q&A, where he's interacted with the students at Lafayette. And of course, he's very funny and he has good crowd work and all that stuff like he always did. But also, I think that as a political communicator, he's somebody who, all of these undergraduate college students at Lafayette, right? I mean, some of them are asking him some pretty annoying college Democrat kinds of questions. And it would be very easy for somebody like Michael, who had a big following and who was very funny and all that stuff. It'd be very easy for him to just kind of make fun of them for asking these annoying questions. And then when people saw it on YouTube later, who liked him, they would have enjoyed it. And, that would have been that, right? But he didn't do that, right? What you see him doing consistently in that Q&A is, maybe he'll say something funny or whatever, but mostly he's actually trying very earnestly to connect with the students and to explain his answers in terms that he knows will make sense to them, that kind of connect to the way they see the world. And I remember actually watching that footage not that long after he died, and just thinking, I don't know who else in left media could do this as well as he could.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I think for everything that you do, thank you so much. I think the way you crystallize your ideas and you articulate them, I think it matters. That's all I can say. Thank you so much for coming on today.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.